I was a very successful residential architect, and many people know me for my books about the not-so-big house and house design. But what they don't know is that in order to write those books, I had to go through a pretty major life change in order to find the time to do that writing. So the story is that when I was a teenager, I longed to be a writer. In fact, I'd written since I was a little kid. And my parents, I think very wisely, said, well, why don't you wait until you've got something to write about? Because I just didn't have a lot of knowledge about anything at the time. And so I went to architecture school, which was another of my loves, and became an architect. So here I was. I had a firm of 45 people. We had a wonderful cooperative environment, but I was incredibly busy. Like, 99% of the population that's in the workforce today, I was being driven nuts by the amount of data and information that was coming across my desk every day. And so I had a sort of epiphany one night, and I talk about this in the introduction to The Not So Big Life, that I was lying in bed reading a science fiction book, actually, and just trying to unwind so that I could prepare myself for another day of the same the next day. And I got hit by that cosmic 2x4 that said, honey, if you want to write, you are never, ever going to get there unless you make a change in your life. And it was just 100% clear that if I didn't do it, nobody else was going to do it. I had to do it myself. And so even though it seemed like the most outrageous thing in the world, I decided to create a time to meet with myself. So I sort of did it like a client meeting, except I was my client. And on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, I set aside a couple of hours so that I could take the time to do this thing that I was absolutely passionate about and had known I was passionate about for a long, long time. And so that began what turned into the Not So Big House series. So I started with this tiny little step of making time for something that I really cared about, in my case, writing. And so I kept writing and writing and writing, and my life has really transformed to being an architect, but also an explainer of why architecture is important. And as many of the listeners will know, that has become an incredible force in the sustainability movement, because people are understanding from these 6 books about house design that smaller but better, where the moreness is about the quality rather than the quantity, is at the core of sustainable living. So I often say that beauty is one of the most important things that we can do for sustainability, because when something is beautiful, it inspires you. So it keeps inspiring every owner of that house, and they keep looking after that house. That's one of the key messages of the Not So Big House. So 10 years go by. The first book came out in 1998. And I knew when I wrote that first book that I had another series of books in me that were not about house design, but about life design. Because what I was learning as I was engaging this thing I was passionate about writing was that what I really wanted to say was, how do we redesign our lives so that we can actually show up in them? Because one of the other things that became so apparent in that moment of epiphany when I was lying in bed reading that science fiction book was that I didn't have time to show up in my life. And I knew I was capable of it. So over the course of this 10 years, as I've been sort of projected into a certain kind of stardom, I've had to learn how to stay balanced. And I knew from a very, very early point in that process that that was going to be the challenge. For me, what was to learn was how to stay balanced in the limelight. We're very familiar with this quote from Mahatma Gandhi, that we must be the change we wish to see in the world. And one of the things that I describe in The Not So Big Life is that we don't completely understand what Gandhi meant. We don't mean that the world out there needs to be fixed. What he meant was that until I can live what I am saying, my words cannot affect you, because you are part of my dreaming. And until I completely understand something, and start to live it and integrate it into my life, I can't speak it with clarity. The story behind the quote is that a woman and her son came up to Gandhi, and the woman asked if Gandhi would ask this really very overweight little boy to stop eating sugar and sweets and candies. And Gandhi said, well, come back in a couple weeks and I'll do my best. And so she looked a little quizzical and she went away, and she came back 2 weeks later and she said, would you now tell my son to stop eating candy? And he looked at the boy and he said, son, stop eating sweets and candy. They're not good for you. And she looked at him and she said, well, that was wonderful, but why didn't you say it 2 weeks ago? And he said, well, madam, it's because I didn't know if I myself could stop eating sweets and candy. So he couldn't tell this boy to stop eating sweets and candy because it was his waking dream, his reality, saying back to him, can you stop eating sweets and candy? And so that he used everything as a reflection. And that's the point of we must be the change we wish to see in the world. So when you focus on something, when you put your intent in something, it attracts to you exactly what you need to know. And indeed, that has happened. Over the last 10 years, teachers have come into my life that have shown me how to stay balanced. And Lord knows I'm an adrenaline junkie. I have, like an awful lot of people today, I'm really addicted to adrenaline. So I have to learn how to not fall into that hole that says, I need more adrenaline, I need more adrenaline. I don't. And that's how to to conserve my own energy so that I can actually show up. So one of the metaphors that I use in the Not So Big Life is that we can look at everything that happens in our everyday life as a waking dream. We've come to understand that at night, our nighttime dreams allow us to see aspects of ourselves. So if somebody shows up in our dream, maybe it's a friend or somebody that you have a hard time with, you can ask yourself, what aspect of myself is that person representing? And then you can use it to learn more about yourself and the obstacles in the way of your being in the moment. You're being able to just flow with what's coming through you at any moment. So as we're in the moment and as we are seeing everything that surrounds us as our waking dream, as that which we are seeing stuff reflected about ourselves. So I'm speaking to you. You're part of my dream reflecting me back to me. So I can see this receptivity, and we're having this wonderful conversation because you're really there. And as we do that, we are able to collectively come forward with an entirely different kind of reality, one where we are all alive. Completely. We've woken up within the dream. I call this lucid dreaming. And it's really possible. So I often describe that when you start to live a not so big life, where you're seeing literally everything in your reality reflecting you back to you, that's the only place that change can happen.